Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Hyperconscious Podcast. Alan, what is hyperconscious?
Once you understand why something is the way that it is, now you have the power to change it. Great conversations with great people and great questions are the keys to the kingdom of unlocking your consciousness.
Every single action that you do starts as a thought. When you control the way you think, you will control the way you act, and you will control the way you live. That is hyperconscious. Gentlemen, welcome back to another very special, as always, episode of the Hyperconscious Podcast. We hope you enjoyed our latest episode where Alan and I sat down and talked all about priorities. Today, we were lucky enough to travel to New York and sit down with Tory Eletto for round 2 in person.
So if you have not listened to round 1, that's episode 166 with Tory Eletto, Mastering Your Relationships. In this one, we talked about the relationship stages. So the first relationship stage is the infatuation stage, where you're head over heels for one another. The second is the power struggle stage, and a lot of people don't get through that. Either they break up or they get stuck there. And then the third one is the commitment stage, and so that's what she went deep on, and I think it's one of the most valuable reps, if not the most valuable rep we've ever done.
I think, and I said this right after, I think it was one of my favorites. So we talked a lot about like intimacy and sex and porn and stuff that a lot of people think is taboo. But I think being able to talk about that openly to help you guys is part of the mission for us. And we learn so much. And if we're learning, you guys are learning. So it is a win-win. We hope you will enjoy.
Talk to you soon.
Bye. Ladies and gentlemen, the Hyperconscious Podcast is proudly sponsored by our friend and mentor, David Meltzer of the Playbook Podcast. He was kind enough to join us on episode 144 and 135.
Folks, it has become Kevin and I's mission in life to help you realize that the life of your dreams is right on the other side of you becoming the greatest version of yourself. Let us help you do that.
I rarely do these things twice in such a short amount of time, but you guys impress me. I believe in people that provide value and of our service. You two guys are on your way to huge fulfillment, purpose, and profitability, and I look forward to helping you both.
We appreciate that more than you know. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another very special, as always, episode of the Hyperconscious Podcast. If you're watching us on YouTube, you can see that Alan and I are sitting on the therapy couch.
Yep.
So that means one thing and one thing only. We are sitting down in person with Tory Eletto. How are you doing?
Hi. Nice to have you guys here.
We appreciate, so the shot on the camera looks really good. Behind the scenes, it is an absolute disaster. So we appreciate you being patient with us and allowing us to work through this.
No worries.
So I know for episode 166, you were on with us. For those who haven't listened, go back and listen because it is next level. But we basically just hammered you with questions because we were so curious about relationship dynamics and therapy in general. So can you go a little bit into your story, who Tory Eletto is, who she was, and how she got to the wonderful lady that she is today?
Oh, okay. So I'm gonna give you a little insight even into like high school.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Because
Going
I
way
think
back.
we're going way back because every therapist I think would tell you, or even any kind of coach or anything, you guys too, right? Like you didn't really you always had these skill sets somewhat in there, right? They're really a part of you, and then you just decide if you want to make a career out of them.
Right.
Right. So in high school, I used to write any kind of relationship I had or any family dynamic. I used to just write, like journal all the time, and was just like, what can I learn from this? Or what's my part in this? And like at like 14. And I was probably too consumed with it. And I actually had told a story like that before where like I was actually really into social relationships because I was so interested in them and how they function and my family. I think that's like the time where you start to see your family in a different way, or you're like, oh, wait, this is a little funky. Right?
Yeah, right.
So I just used to write like crazy about all sorts of things. And it was kind of like my form of like release, but a lot of like knowledge too, and awareness and learning patterns. Like I was doing that stuff at 14. But then that spiraled into, I was always acting as well. And I decided that was a big passion of mine. So after I graduated college, I decided to act for a little bit and try it out. And decided really quickly after like a year it was not the right profession for me. I love it. It's a hobby still. but not the right profession for me, because I wasn't helping people. I wasn't doing that part of me that it just wasn't being fulfilled through acting. Which I think is interesting. I always think of acting where it's like you have to, in order to like embody a character, you have to really understand them in order to like give a good performance. And I feel like therapy is similar, where you're really trying to understand someone, but it's not a performance. You're actually trying to help people, which is what felt different. So then I decided to look into different programs of therapy, because there's a lot of different ways you can be a therapist. You can be a psychiatrist, a psychologist, so many ways. But relational work always spoke to me. I feel like we are, again, a product of our relationships, or the systems around us, and that work is what drives people. I think I said this in our first interview, that it drives people into this room more than anything else. So it's so fundamentally important to us. We get wounded in relationships in our families, and we heal in them, and they're just so vital. So I was drawn to relational work, and then 12 years later, here I am.
Oh my goodness! Lost the headphones.
Tory lost the headphones on that.
I'm glad we're here. I'm glad you made it to the point you're at now, and I'm glad you were nice enough. If you spin it down, yeah, there you go. We appreciate the fact that you were kind enough to invite us out here, because your episode did really well, and we got a lot of good vibes from it. And I think it's because number one, Alan and I, we know a decent amount about relationships, but it's not my profession by any stretch of the imagination. My profession is podcasting. I know a lot about podcasting.
Yes.
And I think everybody wants to know more about relationships, more about love, more about intimacy, about all of those things.
Yep.
So I have a question.
Okay.
Naturally.
Let's do
Since
it.
that's my job. So you'll hear a lot of people say, I saw these red flags and I didn't pay attention to them.
Yes.
What, in your opinion, are red flags?
Oh.
What do they mean? And what do we do about them?
Okay.
Three-part question right off the bat.
We want to know first, what are red flags?
What are red flags? Are they the same to everybody? Does it matter? Like, are
that's
you
a good
basing it
question.
off your past? Like, what is an actual red flag?
Yeah, I think a red flag, well, the way that I would define it, and maybe it is more personal, but the way I would define it is things that we notice that just are off. Or I look at it as like you can see someone's almost like when you start to date someone, let's say, right? We're talking about dating.
Yeah.
You can kind of see how far they've met themselves through certain behaviors, or if they don't respond to boundaries, or they're just the way they're expressing themselves, or you see them yell at the waitress, like certain things like that. Like little moments where you're kind of like, where your instinct is like, ooh, like
Right.
there's something, yours might sound different. It might not sound quite like that. But it's like a little moment where you're like, something seems off, right? It's like
Right.
kind of like you feel it almost, then it's something that you can even always label.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I know exactly. We've all kind of been there.
Yeah.
I went to a moment or two where I'm like, yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So what's the second part of the question? Because now
Yes.
it's like, okay, now what do we do?
What, like, how do you know what a red flag is? Or, like, maybe it's just Alan from time to time will interrupt me.
Right.
That, to me, it's not a red flag. It's not a red flag in this relationship of like, oh, this isn't going to work long term, Alan and I, because we do have a relationship.
Right.
But it's more of like, well, that's part of Alan, and he's working on himself to do better, but that's only because he's so excited to ask you a question. That's why he's interrupting. It's not from any negative thing. So how do you differentiate a red flag from maybe, a character trait that might actually be beneficial down the road?
Right. That's a good question. But I think you kind of answered it in your question. I'm going to tell you how.
Yes. Oh, I love this. This is amazing.
Because the thing is that you have an understanding of each other, right? And also, I'm imagining if you were frustrated, you would go to Alan and be like, hey, we need to work on this. Or
Right.
this needs to, we have to figure this out, although I understand where it's coming from. If Alan was like, all right, yeah, we got to figure this out, then that's not necessarily a red flag. That's more of like a growth area or things that you're working on as like, a partnership, right? But if he completely ignored you, if he blew up on you, if he attacked you, if he ignored you, it's his response to that. That's how you see how far someone is within themselves, right? When they can handle those difficult conversations in a relationship. And I think that's the red flag. It's not the first part. It's the response to addressing things. And that's where you start to cross boundaries, where you start to see someone, handle sitting in some vulnerability. That's when you start to see some of those red flags.
You answered all the questions.
Right. Can you give us an example, maybe in your own personal life, in past relationships, maybe not the one you're in now, where you saw a red flag that, in hindsight, you were like, oh, I kind of knew that, but I didn't acknowledge it, maybe? Because I feel like we, after the fact, when a relationship ends, we look back and we're like, oh, that was kind of there.
Yeah.
But I was blind to it, because we all have blind spots, as you've mentioned. I think you said that in the last episode. And that's why therapy is so important, because you'll reveal those blind spots in a
Or
relationship.
you create the blind spot because you want that person to fit. It's like,
Right.
I can see past this.
Totally.
Everything else is
because
really
this
good.
over
This
here
is
is
good.
really, yeah, right.
Right. So something that I've overlooked in the past. Oh, I had a pattern for a long time.
Can we?
I can show you that
if you're
pattern.
only if you're willing.
No, I'm totally willing. And my husband, he lets me talk about this too. He fits into that as well.
Okay, perfect.
I'm a therapist. I like to talk about things, or about, I communicate when stuff is upsetting or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And I was always drawn to men who couldn't communicate, or didn't want to, or didn't see the value in it, or dismissed it, or tried but couldn't. That was always I was drawn, which we might talk about that with relational stage stuff.
I would love to.
We might get back to that.
Okay.
So I was always drawn to that. So what's interesting was, for whatever the reasons, again, we might talk about that more. But with my husband, he was more open to hearing. We were kind of working together, versus in past relationships where it was just kind of like going nowhere. They were not interested in looking at themselves, which was, for me, is a value in the relationship that I was looking for, or the marriage that I wanted. So that was definitely a red flag that I would look past, but only to a certain point. And then I realized, this is a deal breaker.
I love how you keep saying, look at yourself. Like they were afraid to look at themselves. I think that is an unbelievable way to put it.
Yeah.
Because a lot of us don't look at ourselves, whether it's actually physically looking, or looking within ourselves, or sitting in silence. Most people don't sit in silence.
No.
And that's when your breakthroughs happen. I know you want to get your questions in, so I want to make sure you do.
No, that's just very relevant to one of the questions I was going to ask. But keep going on that.
I was going to say, do you want to do the relationship stages? I know that was your
definitely
intention,
do.
and I don't know how long it's going to take, so I want to make sure we get it in.
Okay.
Do you want to frame it and do it?
Yeah, let's do that. So one of the things that I just wanted to say that you posted on your Instagram that I noticed, speaking of sort of the mirror and looking at yourself, you said that toxic relationships don't make us face ourselves. It's the healthy ones that do. Can you go a little deeper on that, and then we'll get into the relationship stages?
Yes. So toxic, and I think we have to I have to describe what I would say a toxic relationship is. And this does go back to the stages, though. But it's so there's a stage, and we'll talk about it, I guess, in more depth. But in the power struggle stage, when things start to surface, that dopamine kind of settles, and we start to see parts of like the other person that we're like, this is a little bothersome, or I don't really love that, or whatever it is. When we start to see those parts, the toxic space in there comes when we get stuck in that, in those like, let's say the screaming patterns, or the ignore, like whatever pattern comes out, and I'll explain again more, but we get stuck in that, and it becomes more toxic. Like, we're not growing from it anymore. We're focusing on the other. We're calling our friends and we're always crying, or we're calling our friends and we're getting a beer, or whatever it is. Like, we're always in like a state of frustration and tension because the relationship is exhausting and it's not helping us grow. That's what I would describe as a toxic relationship. See, because I think toxic and healthy, there's a fine line. I think there's couples that can work through certain things that can seem toxic, but when they face themselves and they kind of join a partnership that's like healing and helpful, they can turn toxic traits into more helpful, healthy growth, like self-growth kind of relationship stuff. Am I making sense?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. But the toxic stuff is when we get stuck in that, and when we don't know what to do, or we don't have the tools, or we're being too wounded, or whatever it is, and we get stuck in the patterns and the fighting and all of that.
So one of the things that you posted is similar to that, and it was the same thing on this other card I have. From your perspective, you said something, 1 second. Okay, yeah. Instead of desperately trying to get your pain to go away, listen to what your pain is desperately trying to reveal to you. That was on your Instagram.
Yes.
I talk to Kevin about this all the time.
All the
I think
time.
we're trying to escape pain constantly.
Constantly.
And what I try to do this, and I haven't always done a good job in the past, but I try to sit in the pain and figure out where the breakthrough is. I feel like there's a breakthrough on the other end of emotional pain, something that I couldn't see before because I wasn't in pain. Now there's a lesson under this.
Yeah.
There's something to learn from this. And instead of going to get a beer or go get distracted or watch Netflix, I really try to sit in that alone and like contemplate. Right? So what is your take on that? Because I think when you said in toxic relationships you get stuck.
Yes.
You get frustrated and you go escape rather than sit in it and learn the lesson. Have you found that to be true? Can you?
Yeah, because I think that when you're in a healthy relationship, you're taking that space and that time to reflect and to understand and then come back to the relationship, and hopefully you have the other person doing the same. So it becomes more of a growing relationship versus the toxic stuff that you just get stuck in the content of like the BS, right?
Right.
Where like you can kind of go on and on about that stuff, or you can ignore it or numb, which is very, very common, right? Like to kind of just want to go away from it. But I think that gossip part of like of gossiping about a toxic relationship can be very numbing because we're not really facing our own pain, our own stuff, the way we show up in that relationship. We're focused on the other. So when we get stuck in that, that's when it's toxic. The healthy stuff is when we do take the time to really understand and sit with ourselves and who we are in this relationship.
Can we do the relationship stage?
Yeah.
I'm so
You're
intrigued.
ready.
I'm
You're
so
ready to go.
intrigued.
So
we were talking about it on the whole ride down about like we always have like a preamble. Like we've been talking about this all day.
Yeah.
We've been
Right.
we've been together all day. We were
We did a
talking about it in
Facebook
the
Live
hotel.
about it.
Right.
We
So
did a Snapchat story about it.
it's not often that I feel like we know you very well. We've spoken and now we're in person with you. And it's like I have so many genuine itches. I'm already looking at the timer saying like, shit, it's already been 15 minutes. Usually it's not always that way. Sometimes it's like the time doesn't go by as fast.
Right.
But I'm so intrigued. I'm so interested. I want to scratch my own itch. So that's my excuse.
Well, let's rock and roll.
Yeah.
So to bring some context, after round 1, which is episode 166, if you haven't listened to that, go back and listen
Yes.
to it. Shameless plug. But I DM'd you because I reviewed the episode, and you said kind of in passing on that episode, relationship stages. And I noticed that. And I think you said that's a whole nother interview in and of itself. And so I was like, ooh.
And here
all
we
right,
are.
And here we
Here we
are.
are.
So, thoughts become things for those who are willing to work. We made this happen.
Yep.
So you said in the DMs that's a whole nother interview. And you said there's 3 stages. At least these are the 3 that you mentioned. Maybe there's more.
Okay.
There's number 1, the infatuation stage. Number 2, the power struggle stage, which you just alluded to.
Yes.
And then the commitment stage.
Yes.
My question is, you said that's a whole other interview. Can you describe what each stage is?
Yes.
How do you know which one you're in? And how do you effectively move forward?
Right.
That's a lot, I know.
No,
But
that's okay.
we can break it down step
get
by
it.
step if you want.
Yeah. Okay. So the first one, infatuation stage, which can also be romantic love stage, depending. It's that we know that stage easy. It's that dopamine rush stage. It's like when we're like really drawn to someone and we start, and we date them and we're excited and we can't eat sometimes. And it's like all that rush, that kind of really big rush towards somebody. And the beginning stages of getting to know them and all the adrenaline, that's the romantic love infatuation stage. And in that stage, sometimes that's the stage we don't see red flags or we don't accept red flags because we don't want to see them.
Right.
Because what's really interesting about that stage is we're really drawn to our sense of self with another, which is why there's so much dopamine. And what I mean by that is we really like being around that person because of how they make us feel, right? We're like, ooh, I feel like, I'm excited. And I wake up in the morning and there's just like an energy rush because
Right.
of the dynamic. And we really like that. So we're really drawn to that person because of that, which is why it's very easy to look past behaviors that we're like, that's not a big deal because I really like this feeling or I really want to be with this person or whatever it is. So that's the whole beginning stage of what draws us to someone. Now, what's interesting, so this is Imago Theory, and this is by Harville Hendricks. So this is the stages theory. He says that we are subconsciously drawn, like that dopamine rush is drawn to people that ultimately will help us work on ourselves, or we'll look
Right.
at our wounds and from the past and some of our growth areas, right? So that draw serves a purpose.
Absolutely.
Sometimes I think it's in the dating stage and sometimes it's further in, but we get to decide that based on where we are, right? So the next stage that we all unfortunately get to, and you guys, everyone knows this stage because this is where a lot of people stay or get stuck or
Right.
break up,
Right.
is the power struggle stage. And that's when, and usually, the romantic love infatuation stage usually lasts around 6 months. But what I actually found, and I don't know what you guys think about this, is that the more you date, the less that actually exists in like that full romantic love stage. Like it actually starts to kind of connect with the power struggle stage sooner. I find that more now.
Oh, you
Like,
mean
you
the
kinda
more
end-
you spend time, it's not a time thing, it's a amount of time you spend together thing?
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, if you date, like, if you've had a few relationships already, sometimes that
Yeah.
romantic love stage gets entangled with the power struggle stage sooner.
Because doesn't
Oh.
it cross over? Like, don't you
Yeah.
still have some of the feelings, not necessarily
Yes.
of the person, but you
Yes.
have the feelings of a relationship, so it makes sense to go quicker.
Right.
Right?
Right.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, they can merge quicker. I think people can pick stuff up sooner. So right? Is that makes
Okay, so if you've been in more relationships,
sometimes that stage goes quick,
Got it.
or it just combines with the power struggle stage.
gotcha.
And the power struggle stage is when all of our stuff comes out.
Yeah.
Right? When we're triggered, when we see our partner in like the ways that are like difficult or the things that we don't like about them start to surface. It's actually, we start to notice more of what we don't like versus what we do like. And that brings out two typical patterns. One is the fight pattern. If you're trying to communicate in your fight. And sometimes, I don't know if you ever heard of this, the pursuer distancer. Did I talk about that last time?
Please talk about that.
Yes, please.
The big one. That pattern's like one of the most common that I work with, even in my own marriage, actually. Where one person is the one who wants to like talk and is typically more emotional and wants to communicate quicker and all that. And the other person needs a little bit more space and more time or more processing. But what you find is the more that the pursuer pursues, the negatives are they're naggy, they're controlling. The more the distancer distances and they're withdrawn and unemotional. And then you get in these power struggles where that pattern hijacks the relationship. That's a big one.
Mm-hmm.
What are some other power struggles?
Another power struggle.
What's the other pattern?
There's so many, but this is where that stage comes out. What I find is you either have something like that or you have a lot of fighting, like two intense people who are just going at it, nasty, whatever, and then it blows over, and then you kind of just settle back into whatever it is. You enjoy each other, and then the fights come out. You don't know what to do with the stuff that's being triggered and the wounds that are surfacing. So you kind of just go at it. That's the second one I'd say is the most common. And then the third, which is the one you'll see, is that people, if they don't feel like they can effectively communicate through this stuff, what you'll notice is they just start to disconnect, or they don't communicate, or they dismiss stuff, or this is that toxic positivity. They're like, everything's great and fine. They don't address the things that are going on. When I have couples who come in, they're like, we never fight. I'm like, I don't know if that's a good thing.
Right.
We need healthy confrontation. We need the other person to show certain things of us that we need to like look at. So those are the three. And sometimes in that stage, what you'll notice is either you'll break up, you'll get stuck in it, or there's people who live like that in marriages in one of those stages. And I'm sure we can all relate to that.
Oh, yeah.
Or we go to therapy, we read books, and we try to figure out what to do to get to the next, the third stage.
The commitment stage. So you just said something that I wanted to touch on.
Yes.
It says, you wrote on your Instagram, and I said this to you in the hotel room when I was doing my research. Sometimes we use positivity as a mask to cover up the truth.
Yes.
So I've come across couples who have told me it's just supposed to work.
Oh, yeah.
And we never fight. And I remember thinking to myself, like, I don't know if that's a good thing, because I have learned so much through adversity. And I don't mean it negative adversity necessarily, but like through the emotional challenge of trying to like grow with someone. And I would argue that some of the relationships, and maybe I'm wrong, I want your take on this, some of the relationships that quote unquote just work by default and they never fight, I would argue those two people haven't changed a whole lot. They're not growing that much. I've noticed that. Yeah. In my opinion. What is your take on that?
I completely agree.
Right.
I to me, it's something that like sets me back, because to me there's either people, something's going on when someone tells you that the relationship is going smoothly and perfectly and you don't have to work on it, or when they don't, again, everything's perfect all the time, or they don't fight. That to me, something is missing there. And again, I don't always have couples, because couples don't come in here if they're in that stage. But I've had couples who felt that they were in that stage for 15 years, and then all of a sudden things blow up.
Right.
Right? Because how could you not have things?
There's no such thing as life without adversity.
Well, just because you don't talk about it doesn't mean there's not something wrong. I think that's
100% it.
Yeah, that's the thing. If you like, with a lot of people, if you sweep it under the rug, you know how you have those moments, and I'm sure we've all had it, where I could say nothing. And this will go away. Like, this feeling I'm feeling will go away if I don't say anything. But if I say something, I was like, well, maybe. If I say something, we will be closer because of it.
Right.
Every time I have those moments, I have to, like, not slap myself, but I'm like, you have to do this.
Yeah.
You have to have this conversation. There is no, the other way will feel better, but it will not give you the same result.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of what happens with I'm sorry to interrupt the whole flow here, but yeah, so I think that's what happens.
Those are courageous moments.
Those are very courageous moments.
Well, I said to you in the preamble when we were setting up all this equipment, I said every success you see in public is the result of 10,000 courageous moments, tiny little things along the way.
Absolutely.
And I would argue that when you want to sweep something under the rug, let that feeling dissipate, and then just move forward, I would argue that's going to manifest somehow.
For sure.
Eventually. And it's like you had to have courage to like
It's
really
because I'm
face
committed.
that.
It's because I'm committed to getting a better result. I don't want a decent relationship. I've had decent relationships. I've been a decent boyfriend. I don't
Sure.
want to be that anymore. So what is the commitment stage? Like, what does that actually look like?
The commitment stage is when you've learned the tools and you learn the skill sets that you need to continue. And I say continue because it doesn't mean that it goes away.
Right.
It's just you know what it looks like when it shows up, you know how to handle it, and you know what your growth areas are. And you work with your partner. Like, you develop that healthy growth relationship that I think we all probably want. But you're also connected. I think that's the big thing about couples who don't fight, is that they're not as intimately connected either, because you can't be.
Right.
You got to show up when you're kind of coming forward with your own stuff. There's vulnerability, and there's intimacy that comes from that. That you don't get if you're just kind of always in a good space, right? So it's when you mastered some of your patterns, so that again, that doesn't mean they don't exist. It just means you know what to do when they show up, and hopefully they show up a little bit less. And you're looking at your partner as someone who's going to grow with you, and that is able to influence you, and it becomes just a different space versus that power struggle stage where it's the opposite.
I'm learning so much right
I
now.
am too. Can you spin her mic for her so it's head on? Yeah, there you go.
I got it.
just wanted to
Yeah.
make sure.
Thanks.
I wanted to learn more about intimacy in general. So something that I know happens with a lot of couples is the intimacy will just stop.
Sure.
And in your experience, I'm sure there's not like, oh, it's always this. Obviously, I'm sure it's not that general. But what are some of the common causes of intimacy kind of dropping off, and how do you fix that?
You mean sexual intimacy?
Sexual
Because
intimacy,
intimacy means more than just
Sex.
Yes. So how do you handle it?
Yeah, how do you figure out without going to the person and saying like, hey, why aren't we having sex anymore? Because obviously that, when I was younger, I'm sure that was the way.
That would be the way?
That would be the way. But I think for a lot of people that
Yeah.
comes a problem, and then the masculine energy, or the man, depending on the relationship, won't want to spend the same amount of time because they feel like they're not getting their needs met, and it's a whole thing.
Right.
And because, right. When you're around someone that you're attracted to for long periods of time, you get horny, for lack of better phrasing, and then that causes
for lack of better
frustration,
phrasing.
sexual frustration.
Yes.
And answer that.
that
I didn't mean to interrupt. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Well, okay, so I'll tell you this. The old school version of why was because that something was wrong in your relationship. Like something, you were disconnected, so you disconnect sexually, right? Which I think there's truth to that in some ways. Okay. I think the new school version, right? And I mentioned her last time, and I want to mention her because she talks a lot about this. It's really good stuff. Her name is Esther Perel. She talks, it's much more modern. But she talks more about just how all the good things about a relationship can be the opposite in maintaining that erotic life between two people, right? Long term.
Right.
All that, that adrenaline, that dopamine, all that excitement stuff, that kind of just fades when you see someone every day brushing their teeth and, taking a shower. Like, that stuff doesn't kind of stay. So what we have to figure out is how to create that sort of erotic, intimate world with someone. It's I don't want to say it's work because that sounds draining. I think it's fun work. It's good work. It's important work, right? I think we all want to be intimately connected. I think sex is so important in a relationship. But first of all, it always fades at some points. And I think that scares people because people are like, oh my God, we're not having sex. This is all wrong. And that's not true. There's going to be ebbs and flows, and you have to be able to accept that. Because, you don't want to accept that.
How do you know
what's an ebb?
Right. How do you know what's an ebb and a flow? And how do you compare it to what should be versus what is? Like, how do you know when it's off versus on in terms of like the frequency and intensity?
Well, I think that's what you have to distinguish. Is it a frequency thing? Because sometimes it is. Or is it the energy that you want with someone when you have sex? Because you can have sex 10 times a week, but it's kind of the same sex and you're a little bit bored.
Right.
Or you can have a really intense, amazing sex once a week or whatever, frequency-wise. But you have to figure out what the challenge is, and everyone's is different. But I think most people want that excitement stuff too, even if they want the frequency. But people want that, you want to figure out how do you have that with a long-term partner?
Right.
Because that comes so naturally with strangers and new people and new people you're dating. So that's kind of more about this erotic world that you have to create with your.
What are some good ideas to do that? Because you and I have talked on the last episode. I've found I don't know if this was offline after the episode or before, but I've found that you have two extremes, and maybe these you'd refer to as patterns. But I notice most relationships intimate relationships are on one end. Typically, it's someone who is unbelievably connected. They're like best friends. They do everything together.
Yes.
And they live together, and they seem super happy. And it seems like their relationship goes very well
Absolutely.
overall, but maybe they're not having a lot of sex.
Yep.
And you can almost kind of tell that there's not much polarity there anymore because they're very similar now.
Yeah.
Right? So that polarity of energies is not quite. And then you have the other side, which is like sort of a little bit of a relationship roller coaster, but there's a lot of sex.
Right.
And there's makeup sex, and there's post-fight sex,
Breakup,
and there's,
makeup.
makeup, all that. So how do we dance between these two extremes? Because I've been on either one.
Yeah.
And neither one is what I want.
I know. Because the up and down and the fighting, I mean, that creates that autonomy, that push-pull, all that adrenaline gets naturally created. When you have a best friend type, right? First off, you still have to have attraction, right? You can't just have a best friend and be like, we're going to forge some attraction.
Right.
There has to be attraction there from the get-go.
For sure.
But to tap back into it, it's like anything else. You have to create it as a priority, right? So you have to make space for it in your lives. You have to, say, instead of looking at my phone, I'm going to go over and just flirt a little bit for a second, right? There has to be ways that you build up intimate moments in order. It's all like the foreplay, and it's not even sexual foreplay. It's all the foreplay of those moments in between that allows you to have that energy remain in your relationship, or you get back in touch with it.
What are so you were just talking about basically you have to make it a priority.
Yes.
To flirt and to create those moments in between, not necessarily sexual moments. So what are some good ideas for couples to start trying to maybe create some of that passion, that fire for each other?
Yeah. Well, I think first off, it comes from being centrally connected to yourself. If you lose that, right? If you stop feeling like a sexual being, it's very hard to feel that way with someone else. And that's easy to do with kids and work and life and laundry and whatever else you got going on. It's very hard to lose that connection to feeling like a sexual being, right? It's almost sometimes people feel like they have to turn that off at some point, and they're just like a family man or a mom or whatever. That's if you have children, obviously. But that's an easy thing to turn off. So you first have to get in touch with that, right? It always starts with us. We have to be
How do we do
connected
that?
first.
How do people know when they're not in touch with that?
The desire isn't there.
Okay.
Right? And even if you have, and tell me what you think about this, even if you have desire for other people, that's not necessarily, that's normal, that's healthy, but it's where you go with that desire. You go, I'm candid here, but do we go and do we masturbate to porn, or do we go and we channel that energy into our partner? We have that energy. I mean, if you're completely disconnected, you have no desire, then wow, I've lost touch with that part of me. Or maybe I never even had touch with that part of me before. But if you've lost it along the way, it's the lack of desire. And then if you haven't, then it's where is that desire going? And porn is a big one. I mean,
Can we talk about porn?
We can talk about porn.
So Alan and I have talked about this. I used to have like an addiction to porn, and I've
hear that a lot.
never said that on the podcast. This is the first time I've ever said that. So, and what a better time to say it. I'm not adamantly against it because I feel like anything, in little spurts might not be the worst thing in the world. I don't know.
Yeah.
And the science behind it does say that it rewires your brain. Like it
does.
It legitimately does. And I think there's a reason when you're watching a football game, it's all Cialis. I mean, that's obviously they're advertising to who they think need it. But now it's at the point where there's 20-year-olds using it, and now you can get it sent to your door discreetly, so it's not, you don't even have to go to a doctor anymore. And I think that's going to make this worse and worse, and I'm sure it's not good for a lot of relationships if that's where they're going with this with this passion and the desire. So what have you noticed regarding relationships in porn? Ladies and gentlemen, we hope you are enjoying this episode where Alan and I were lucky enough to sit down in person with Tory Eletto for round number 2. If you haven't joined the Hyperconscious Nation Facebook group yet, it is growing steadily. And you guys are adding so much value, and we appreciate you doing introductory posts. Is that a word?
Introductory posts.
That's a word.
Right.
Introducing yourself to the group, I know that can be scary, but again, we're all about chasing your fears, getting out of your comfort zone, and if that's something that you're doing, we are proud of you. Loving the group so far.
It's honestly super fulfilling to be a part of this community, and I'm already blown away by how much I love the Facebook group. I've been going live just about every single day. You actually chimed in on one of my live videos recently.
I did. We're actually going to go live right after we record this.
And so one of the things that I've been posting on social media about personal development and hyperconsciousness really for, ever since the fruition of this podcast, but I love being able to post on social media with a community that I know will resonate with this stuff, a community that I know wants to get better, and that's super fulfilling. So that's a good opportunity for any of you to fear chase, go live on there, do videos on there, engage with each other. We did an episode on support. That's what this community is all about. I want to elevate the whole team.
So head on over to the hyperconsciouspodcast.com, click join Hyperconscious Nation at the top of the page, and it will take you to the Facebook group, answer the questions, and you're in. We cannot wait to see you over there. Do you think that we should get back into the episode?
Yes, we should.
All right, let's do it. Talk to you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
It's a big topic. I think that porn addiction is very common, first off. And what's interesting about porn is there's nothing intimate or erotic about it. It's an image or whatever, right? You're watching it, boom, bang, done. Like, it's over with.
Yeah.
You're not using any part of your sensuality. There's no erotic parts of you that are actually coming out in porn. It's pretty black and white. Like, there's none of that. So if you continually watch porn, you're losing the space to do that, and then you lose that space to do that with someone else.
You're also releasing the energy and the desire in a way that isn't moving anything forward, at least personally or intimately with someone else.
Right.
And also, I mean, obviously, people know that porn is a huge industry.
Yes.
But literotica is also equally big, and people don't talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the feminine energies version of porn.
Right.
So can we talk a little bit about those two extremes and what if we channeled that energy in our own real life instead of the digital world or maybe in books?
Right.
Right? Because 50 Shades of Grey is an unbelievably best-selling, famous book.
Yes.
And it's giving some of that maybe mystery that you talked about on the last episode,
Yes.
and that's danger but also safe, but that exciting feeling and maybe the more erotic stuff. So
Right.
on one extreme you've got porn, which is none of that,
None of
and
that.
then all of that on the other extreme.
Yeah, that's a
and
good
it's
point.
obvious that we're craving that in other human beings and real connection and love and moving forward together.
Good question.
Like, I need your take on that whole thing if you don't mind.
Yeah, well, I think the 50 Shades of Grey is a great example because I think that was such like a private, like, it's almost like when people read that book or women or men, I don't know if many men read it, but if women read it and they're like, ooh, like I have a sexual side, like I'm feeling this a little bit, like it like awakened to people.
Right.
Right. But I think what's interesting about that, is where do you do with that energy? Where do you go with it?
Right.
What do you bring it into your relationship? Do you figure out a way? Because I think sex is very vulnerable, especially in a long-term relationship.
Right.
It's vulnerable because you want to try something or you want to share something. Like, it's not an easy thing to bring up. It's a hard topic of conversation. And there's a lot of feelings around rejection if your partner doesn't want it.
Right.
Like, there's so many vulnerabilities there that we don't realize. It's one of the most vulnerable spaces. So in order to kind of step into that zone with your partner, it requires a lot more from us than kind of getting our needs met outside, including from other people, right? Affairs and cheating and all of that. So it's a different stage, and I think we have to, like anything else in a relationship, we have to create space and energy and work for it. Like, we cannot just assume it's going to just we all know that it doesn't. I mean, all of us, there's not one person, going back to the people who everything's perfect, there's not one people who don't have to work at this.
Right.
This is everyone's problem. So
Unless they're willing to settle for regular.
Right.
Or average or
right, if that's
whatever.
good, if that's good enough for them, then that does work, and that's fine. Or sometimes people do have sexless marriages, and that works for them too. But for the most part, that's a big part to like kind of.
It's gonna be a hard no.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I agree with you. Hard no.
Yes.
You don't want to lose touch with that part
Right.
of you, and the part of your partner.
How do you? Okay, so it's easy to say like, I prioritize the gym, even though I don't like doing it sometimes. I do it because I want a nice body.
Yes.
In a relationship, how do you prioritize sex when I'm stressed out, when I don't feel good about myself? Like, how you don't want to force yourself to do it, right?
Right.
So what is the actual like mechanism of going from we're not having sex because of these reasons to let's talk about why we're not to let's explore, like, how does it actually happen from lack of sex to getting back into like a passionate lovemaking relationship?
That's a good question. Well, I think sometimes we have to be able to say, I am absolutely exhausted. I cannot even get into the headspace of that. But the problem is that can easily become a pattern, right? You can be tired. I'm tired every day.
Right.
I have a daughter. I'm exhausted every day. But the thing is that can't be the go-to, right? Because like anything else, like going to the gym or like doing anything that requires a little energy, you might have a little resistance. But it's once you move past that resistance, if you kind of get going and things start moving, that's all you need. So you just have to kind of find that line between like today's a real no and like I need some space versus like today's that time where I should push, like the way that you push to the gym, because it's the same exact thing.
I may not want to, but I'll be glad I did.
Yes,
That's
exactly
that's how I always think. I will be glad I did.
I will be glad I did.
Yeah, you're never gonna regret doing it if you just push yourself a little.
Right.
And then after the fact, all that. Yeah.
It's so interesting to think of it that way, though.
It is.
That's how I think of it. It's
For
gonna
sex?
Yeah, sometimes.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
I've never not been glad I did.
Oh no,
And vice versa. I think,
I'm the type to always want it.
Same
Right.
most of the
For
time.
me-
so maybe I'm biased, but
right. So thinking of somebody having to work through it isn't a foreign thought to me.
Right.
But it's an interesting perspective that I've never really necessarily taken. So I enjoy hearing that side of it, and it helps me, I think,
Yeah.
show empathy and help. I think that's the thing. Like, I always want it.
Right.
So it's like, oh, you don't. Is it me? Is it? I think that's a huge part in relationships too. Is
Yeah.
the story I'm telling myself. Brene Brown. I know you're big into her, and
Yeah.
that has changed my relationship 100% with everything.
Yes.
It's always now. She'll either Taryn will say the story I'm telling myself, or I'll say it, because that just right off the bat lets you know that I don't even know if what I'm thinking is right. It most likely isn't. But this is what I'm feeling.
That's what's going on.
So, like, just let me air this out.
Yeah.
So I wanted to talk about vulnerability, and we can jump back into sex if you have more questions. But
yeah, I did have.
You
I
have
do
more
have-
questions.
I do have more questions.
so we in the preamble, I said, like, I really want to talk about vulnerability because I'm really passionate about that now, and I think it's helping me tremendously. I think a lot of men specifically, and I'm sure that women are the same, but I haven't really dealt with it that much. They are afraid to be vulnerable. What is vulnerability actually? Like, what is the actual act of being vulnerable? And why, if I came up to you and you told me to do it, and I said, why should I do it? Tory, why should I be
Why is it
vulnerable?
important?
Yeah. So what is it, and why is it important?
Vulnerability is, and I think I described it like this last time, is showing up, but like other parts of us, like deeper parts of ourselves or our full self, like showing up without necessarily knowing where it's going to go. So we don't always know if it's going to, be a hit or miss, right? When we know it's not vulnerable, we're like, yeah, we're going to do this. It's going to work out. Great.
We may or may not win.
We may or may not win.
Oh,
This
that's the
may or may
worst.
not go well, or I don't know how they're going to take this, or this feels like, but I'm going to do it anyway, and I'm going to share it anyway, or I'm going to put myself out there, whatever it is that's vulnerable, right? It's kind of making that step. And the reason why it's so important is when we think of it with people, it's how we connect. It's where we have our deepest connection. Like, we can BS and have like surface talk, but if we go there, if I share something with you and you're like, oh, I felt that, like, that's a deeper connection. And especially when you're in an intimate relationship, those are the moments, right, that kind of bring you back. And we need those moments. That's what we crave when we want connection. We can do all the other stuff too, but that is what we really want. We want someone to really see us, and we can't really obviously have that unless we're willing to show ourselves.
It takes courage to own the truth and to
does.
share the truth, like you just did. With
Oh,
the,
yeah.
with the
Yes,
addiction
that was a
thing.
big
That
one.
and that
But-
increased all of our connection.
But
in
it's
this room.
interesting for me because it's not as hard. I feel like it's easier for me now.
Because it's something
Well, that
that's
you
on
have
your mind.
practice.
Well,
You've
because I
practiced
have
it.
practice.
Right.
When I'm in front of this microphone, I almost forget that there's an outside world.
Yeah.
I almost forget that people are going to hear me. For me, it's this moment, and then, like, who knows? We might be driving back. I'm gonna be like, yo, we gotta delete that. We gotta delete that.
Right. Speaking of which, you
That's
have final cut,
vulnerability.
by the way. Yeah.
You say anything you don't want to say,
Yeah.
we'll delete it. No, but I think for me, I understand that I'm trying to be more vulnerable than anybody else because I know that I can handle the feedback, even if it's painful, especially if it's painful, because I understand that a lot of it will be, but it's not always from an actual, you're screwing up. It's not that. If Alan or Taryn or a friend of mine says, you're making me feel this way, that hurts me. Because I'm not doing it intentionally. I would never do it intentionally. I would never hurt you intentionally. But I know I need the feedback because then I can adjust.
Right.
So I think vulnerability is everything.
I'm so impressed with your ability to do that. I was
appreciate
blown
that.
away that you admitted that on
appreciate
air.
that. I
And I
appreciate that.
think that it gives other people the permission to own their own truth.
That was my thought.
Absolutely.
My thought was if somebody was hearing this and maybe they've been waiting to like release something, maybe.
Yeah.
If you're waiting to release something, it doesn't have to be to your entire
Yeah.
community of listeners, but maybe it's
maybe don't.
Maybe it's your loved one, or maybe
Right.
it's your
Yes.
significant other, your parents, or whoever it is. Don't hold on to that stuff because that stuff is what weighs you down. Well, you want to talk about sex?
I actually do have a question.
Yes.
So when you had said, I've never felt that way because I've always wanted it, I'm that way too. But I've been digging deep with some of my clients. I'll keep it anonymous. And I've also picked the brains of many feminine energies, women.
Yes.
And what I've found is that they, a lot of times, have boyfriends or intimate partners that always want sex. And if physical touch, one of the love languages, is their boyfriend or their significant other's main love language, they're afraid to even do the hugs and kisses because
Oh,
they know
yes.
where it's going to lead, and
Yes.
they're not ready. Can we go into that?
I was going to say something about that.
Because as a man, that is how I feel loved, period. It doesn't have to be sex. It
Just
can
touch.
be any touch.
Yes.
Any words of affirmation and touch, those are my big ones. But if you're afraid that it's going to lead me to sex and
Right.
you're not ready and you don't want to reject me,
Right.
then that's something that I've found very frequently in
Absolutely.
people I've tried to help. And I think it holds relationships back tremendously. Can you go into that?
I absolutely agree. But it's similar. It's the similar mindset to porn. It's like moving quickly, boom, bang, boom, done, right? You're missing the eroticness of it. You're missing the creativity, the touch, the feeling, the bodies, all the things that build up that actually create more of that like erotic world that you were saying. But really what we both need, we're missing all of that when we just always want to kind of zoom right into sex, right?
Right.
And a lot of people do feel, I know women in particular feel that way, that if we start to cuddle or something,
Right.
it's going to go there and I'm not sure I want it to go there, so I'm going to cut off all of that.
Exactly.
Right?
Which is like, whoa.
Yes.
And then you tell yourself a story about why
Right.
aren't we
Right.
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 So
Yes.
how can you communicate, or I know you can, how
Yeah.
should you communicate that if, say, you're a woman listening to this right now,
Right.
and this is what you're going through, you're kind of taking a step back and putting up a little bit of a wall with your significant other
Yep.
because you don't want to open that door yet. You're not ready to be sexual.
Right.
But you know you don't want to be like snuggling and hugging and kissing because it might open the door.
Yeah.
How do you communicate that to them? Because like Alan said, most men are going to take that personal because they
Oh, yeah.
assume it's
Yeah.
because of them.
They're going to think it's because I'm not attractive
Right.
anymore. You're not attracted to me
Right.
anymore.
Right.
I'm not doing something right. I'm doing something wrong. But those are all stories we're telling ourselves. It's crap. But it's like, especially at the beginning in the infatuation stage when it was rocking and rolling
Yeah.
left and right and you
Easy.
felt like a superhero.
Yep.
And then that all
That
changed. It's
changes.
like, what, and you're trying to figure it out. It's a whole
But
thing.
you're highlighting a good point, which is a big growth area in intimacy and sex, is that when it's becoming part of like our, I don't want to say worth, but sort of rejection.
Right.
And when we feel sexually rejected and then we're not attractive, when we start to personalize someone else's wanting or not wanting, that's a big growth area there. Because then we start to figure out like that's like we're not focused on the other partner. You're focused on yourself.
Right.
Right.
Right. So in those moments, if I think you had asked the question of like, what do you do? If that's
Yeah.
becoming a pattern, and then you notice there's like anxiety creeping in on some end or on the female's end because like, oh, I don't even want to touch because this might start to happen.
Yep.
I start off where we kind of take sex off the equation, but we still create intimate nights, let's say, or an intimate evening, or let's say like on I don't know, this is the kind of thing where it's not necessarily scheduled in, but you have to prioritize it, right? So define what that medium is.
Yep.
On a Friday night, we're gonna be intimate and we're gonna light candles and we're gonna touch, we're gonna massage, but we're not having sex. And you kind of start to build that relationship up that you can actually do all that. And sometimes it leads to sex because it's off the
Right.
table. But really what you're trying to do is you're trying to alleviate the anxiety. You're like, wait a minute, let's write that down. No, but sometimes it doesn't, right? It depends how deep the anxiety is for the other.
Yeah.
But what you're doing is you're eliminating it so they're safely going there with you. And then you see where that going there takes you. And sometimes it takes a little bit to build up to sex, but really you're kind of trying to take that off the table so they feel safe to kind of rebuild that intimate
Right.
stuff.
And then they feel like this is something they want to do, not something they're obligated to do.
And
Yes.
you're focused on them. If
You're
it's
focused
that,
on them,
I don't
right?
want to give you a bad massage. I'm going to give you the best massage possible. If that's what I'm able to do here, I'm going to give you the best one I can give you.
Yeah, and the other end, you're not focused on being rejected, which can
Right.
also create anxiety and tension and stress,
Yeah. I
right?
know.
You don't go into that like natural. You're like, ooh, what is going to go? You know, you kind of have to
know.
wean through that. So if you go into it knowing what it is, that's that kind of like foreplay stuff that actually ends up leading to better sex lives.
We're talking a lot about sex, and I like it because I think I said this earlier. I told Alan this. I am more confident talking about taboo topics in person because I can see you and I can feel your energy.
Yeah.
It's just easier because I can see your facial
gauge
expression.
if
Yeah,
you're right.
I want to make sure we ask Shauna's question.
Oh, that's right. Good
So
call.
we put into our Facebook group today, Hyperconscious Nation. If you haven't joined, come join us. Sign up. So every time we have a guest, we're going to sit down in our Facebook Live that we do like a week ahead of schedule and say, do you want us to ask this week's guest anything? And Shauna Pelton, where did I put it?
She's amazing, by the way. She was one of the speakers at Confident Women's Consortium.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, brought me up on stage. We had a crazy breakthrough. I don't mean to
No,
hijack
you're good.
the
I
thing,
needed,
but
I
Shauna's
needed
awesome.
you to buy me some
Yeah.
time because I couldn't find what
We'll
where I wrote it.
we'll introduce you at some point.
Okay, I would love that.
Yes, she is next level. Okay, so what if your partner has different interests than you? Maybe you've been together for a long time and you had a common thing that brought you together and you stayed together, but your interests grew apart. Like what happens at that point?
And what do you do about
And
it?
what do you do?
If you, I see, I don't think. I mean, I know that it's out there that you should have the same interests. I don't think that that's always true. I don't think you have to have. I don't think there's anything that has to be. I think what's interesting if you have different interests, there's separateness, and I think that can be a good thing. I think you just have to make sure you're not separate and not connecting at all, right? There has to be something that brings you together, or maybe trying something new, or something that kind of creates a connection. But I don't necessarily think it has to be shared interests.
This is leading me to another question.
Yeah.
Do you find that most couples, that you've seen and worked with, in your opinion, fall on one end where they spend too much time together, they do everything together, and they refuse to have separate lives at all, and they lose some of their individuality, which creates sexual polarity?
Sure.
Or they're on the other end where maybe they don't have enough commonality and prioritizing time together.
Yes.
Do you find those two extremes most of the
Absolutely.
time?
Yes.
Okay. How do we dance between those two extremes
And I
more
think-
effectively?
I think they fall because I think we have to. I think that's that like really delicate balance of connectedness and right and
Individuality.
individuality, right? Remaining connected to who we are and what makes us unique in ourselves, but realizing that benefits the relationship, but also making sure we're prioritizing that connection. So I think it's really about checking in. And kind of gauging, you're always gauging where things are because things are shifting and changing all the time, right? So if you feel like, wow, we haven't had a date or even if we have, we really haven't like deeply connected in a long time, let's put that on the calendar or however you do it, right? I'm talking from a married child person.
Right.
I have a calendar.
Yeah, let's put
but like
this on
let's
the
make
calendar.
sure, not even like we write it in, but like we like realize like this is something that we need to prioritize.
Okay, sorry, I
No,
didn't mean
go
to
ahead.
interrupt you. So in your marriage,
Yes.
what are some strategies that you employ consistently
Mm-hmm.
to make sure you two are connecting, but also maintaining your own
Separateness.
individuality?
We make sure we're connected and also as a family and then ourselves. So there's a lot of parts to connection, right?
Right.
So I think the thing that we always do is connection doesn't have to be big. It can be small moments. I think we misinterpret it as like it needs to be 3-hour thing or we have to go to this fancy dinner.
Oh yeah.
Right? Which are all nice things.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And sometimes needed,
Yeah.
for sure. But, I come home every night from, if when I'm working and I come home, and even when I'm not, when I'm home and he comes home, we make sure we connect at least for 10, 15 minutes every day just about like stuff. Like I'll ask unique questions. I'm not just like, hey, how was your day? Good. How are you? Bye. And we disconnect.
Right.
Like I'll ask because I knew something was, and he's in finance. God love him, but I'm not interested in that. But I'm interested in him. So I'll ask him a question, or I remember he had a meeting and he remembers something to me, and we actually deeply connect maybe for 15 minutes. And then one of us, wants to go to the gym or take a shower, and like we disconnect, right? But it's enough. We have to gauge what our tank is, right, between us, or we think of it like a bank account.
Do you measure it personally? Like, where am I at in my intimate relationship? 0 to 10. 10 being like over the moon, everything's great. 0 being like, oh no, what's going on?
We're low right now.
Right. And then, because I do this with my clients all the time, week to
Yeah.
week. Where are you at in terms of your physical body? How do you feel about yourself? And how do you feel physically?
Right.
And usually they'll give me a number. And I'll say, okay, what would make you a 10? What are the habits we can do this week to get you back?
Right.
Because if you're in a bad peak state, like a bad state, you're going to tell yourself negative stories and you're going to have bad strategies, in my
Yes.
opinion.
Yeah.
So, and the same goes for relationships. So how do you measure it for you?
For me personally, I'm so connected to it. I feel it. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, we're pretty, we prioritize it. So we're pretty much on it. I think in terms of just making sure we're connected and intimate stuff, like we have to work on that stuff. But I don't know. It's very natural for me at this point because we've worked hard on it. But I think I gauge it internally. If I miss him.
Was it
or-
always natural or did you
No,
have to develop
my
that
God,
habit?
no.
Okay.
We broke. Actually, my husband and I, we broke up for a year. I never thought we'd get back together.
Really?
Yeah, we
Interesting.
broke up in that power struggle stage. I was like, oof, not for me.
So
And
what?
same for him.
What changed?
Right.
Like what was the process? And if this is too much, just
No,
let me.
it's okay.
But what was the process of getting through that back together and then realizing like, okay, now I have to go all in if this is actually going to work. So I have to.
What changed?
Right. Like, how did you work through that?
When you decided you wanted the commitment stage.
When we were ready for it. Well, I think what we did was when we were in that power struggle stage and we were in it like hardcore, I repeated this pattern. I'm really good at this talk, right, guys? Like I do this all the time. So I used to out-talk a lot of my ex-boyfriends. God love them. But I did. And they would leave the relationship going, I have a lot to work on. And I'd walk away being like, yeah, you have a lot to work on.
Right.
My husband, I was like, oh, I'm good at this. My husband was the first one to be like, you have stuff to work on too. And and one of the things was, and I think this is important to say because this is a big one I see in couples that I work with. He said to me, and I'll never forget it, you're controlling. And let me tell you something. I'm in my head, the way I define controlling, I'm like, no, I'm not. I'm like, I'm careful, I'm kind, I'm warm. In my head, I'm like, I can't see that, but I valued him so much and his perspective and who he was. I was like, I have to hear that message somehow. And I sat with it. I was like, I keep repeating these patterns. There's something here I have to hear. And I didn't contribute to controlling, but I figured out what it was. is that I was so good at this stuff that I really wasn't seeing myself as much. I really wasn't. I was so focused on him and his areas and what he needs to do and blah, blah, blah. And I was really good at talking about it and being soft and whatever. It didn't matter. All of my energy was being poured towards him. A little like of that codependent stuff. And he was like, you just don't, even if you're 10% of the problem, you don't look at that 10%. You look at my 90. And that, for him, felt controlling. And I really needed to hear that. And that was one of our last arguments when we broke up. And that stirred me back into therapy. I was like, here I go again. I got to go do this again. I've been, and I
Eating her own cooking here.
Eating my own cooking. I got to figure this out again or go back to the couch.
It's harder with self, I'll tell you what.
It is. And I had to really look at that part of me. And there was truth to it. And he was the first person that made me see that. And that's what drew me back to him because I was like, wow, he's making me grow. This man is challenging me.
That answers. You want me to go?
You can. I just something jumped off the page.
All right, we're running out. We got
okay.
like 8 minutes max.
This will
7 minutes.
take 30 seconds.
Just want to make sure.
Something for the listeners that really jumped off right there for me that resonates so deeply with my heart. The fact that you valued him so much.
Yes.
I always say this, like the things that you desire most, the things that are most valuable to you, they're the scariest because you care.
Yeah.
And when things don't go right, which they won't all the time, it's going to hurt. And we avoid pain, but you can't because you had to self-reflect because you cared about him so much to do it.
Yep.
And I've been in relationships where I didn't care to that level.
Yes, me too.
And they didn't help me grow. Why? Because I don't care enough.
You're not.
And I didn't know, that I didn't. So you got to self-reflect on how much do I really care about this thing. But I truly believe the things that we want in persons, places, and things, the things we genuinely desire, desires of the heart, are going to force us to become the people we were meant to be.
Agreed.
And for all the listeners out there, if there's someone out there that you care for deeply that has hurt you, maybe there's something there that it can teach you. Because if you care that much, maybe it's the one thing that'll get you to look at self.
Absolutely. And that's what, and I think that's what drew me to doing my own work. Him the same. And we were lucky to come back together and just kind of build from there.
I was going to say, so first of all, I think what we should do is let you plug where people can find you, just because since we're doing this new camera shoot, we want to make sure that we get everything we can, and I don't want to end, and then, it's a whole thing. So I want to make sure people can find you. We're actually in your room that you were talking about.
Yes.
And it's incredible.
Thanks.
It's incredible. We enjoyed, one of the first thing we said when we got in here was like, there's the energy. You can feel the energy. There's positive energy. So if somebody wants to sit on this very couch that we're sitting on and they're in the New York area, I don't know exactly what area people,
we are?
yeah, I don't know anything. so where,
Plug it in the
again,
GPS.
where can people find you? How can they schedule sitting down? Like, it's all about yourself.
I am in Mamaroneck, which is in Westchester County, New York. It's about a half hour out of Manhattan. And my website is emotionpsychotherapy.com. But mainly, most people now find me through my Instagram, which is NY Therapist,
which is
New York
awesome.
Therapist.
Yes, that's where we
Love
found
your
you.
gram.
And I actually also do, which is very different than therapy, but I do coaching calls.
Nice.
Yeah, so I do some like coaching work through relationships and with people, and it's not as intense as therapy, but I do that like on Skype, Zoom kind of thing.
Hell yeah. Technology is an incredible thing, isn't it?
Right.
Yes.
One thing I wanted to say, and it was very similar to all that, is I wrote this down, and you basically answered it, but everybody says hindsight is 20/20. And when you get out of a relationship, it's easy to look back and say, I screwed that up. Like, I really screwed up in those moments. I was really insecure.
Yeah.
What a lot of pain behind those eyes.
Right.
What is a way where while you're in the relationship, you can really actually take a good look at yourself proactively, not on a reactive basis where like shit hits the fan and you have to.
Yeah.
Like how can you schedule time to look at yourself, figure out your insecurities, figure out your part and what's going on, and figure out like your strengths and your weaknesses?
Well, I think the first part is first of all, knowing what triggers you, especially in your partner, because what triggers you, especially what really triggers you, that's highlighting some growth areas and probably some old wounds from family dynamics.
Oh, yeah.
Big stuff.
Yeah.
So that's a big one, and that's there. And the other thing is letting your partner influence you. I think that the couples that struggle the most come in here and they want to be right and they want to influence their partner, but they don't want to be influenced. But in that moment that I shared with that control thing, again, I could have fundamentally disagreed with that, but there was something in there I needed to hear. And I think that's the thing. We don't have to get caught up in the language or the terms controlling, right? I throw that out there because it's like, oh, who wants to hear that?
Right.
But I'm saying it because we hear those things. But I had to get to the core message there that behavior was feeling controlling to him, and it was my part in the power struggle that we were in. So if we can just sit with some of that on a smaller basis, right, and have those hard conversations and hear the other person and let them influence our self-growth, that, and you have two people who are doing it, you're unstoppable.
Ooh.
I think this is probably my favorite podcast to date.
Yeah, man. This is
I
unbelievable.
genuinely feel that way. So we have
Thanks.
roughly a minute and a half.
Okay.
Do you want to hammer something quickly? Alan,
Super
quickly.
fast. Super fast.
Let's do it.
First of all, this has been amazing. Thank you so much
Thank
for letting all
you.
of this happen. You posted on your Instagram at New York. What is it? At
NY
New York
Therapist.
Therapist.
New York
At
Therapist,
NY
yep.
Therapist. Yep.
Yep.
We feel listened to through acknowledgement. We feel heard through changed behavior.
Yes.
Can you go a little deeper on that? Because I think that's super powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And you already just said, be willing to be influenced by your partner.
Yeah.
I think one of the reasons why people aren't is because they think they're right and they don't see the other person's value or perspective. So can you go a little deeper on being influenced by your partner, why that's a good thing,
Yeah.
and what you meant by that quote?
Well, I think influenced by your partner, I mean, they're your mirror. Like, no one else has that relationship with you, right? I can be here with you guys and I can go home and no one's going to see that side of me. And and that's where we grow, right? In those like moments where we're like exposed and raw and wounded and all that. That partner is meant to help you and teach you. And if you respect them and you value them, right? Hearing them and what they have to say and their experience of you, it doesn't mean you have to accept everything they say or the exact wording of what they say. But hearing what, the core message, if there's something you have to take from what they're complaining about or sharing with you or whatever their need is that's not being met, those are highlighting our growth areas. And when we can frame it that way, it's a lot less threatening to hear it.
Right.
Because we're like, wow, this person's helping me grow versus like, oh, they're attacking me or whatever the feeling is, right? And the other part of the listening and kind of, what was it?
We feel listened to through acknowledgement.
Yes.
We feel heard through changed behavior.
Yes, I wrote that from my own experience, because if I'll have a deep conversation with my husband and it feels really nice, but when I see him act out of that conversation, I'm like, oh, he heard me, right? And vice versa. It's like I hear him and I'm like, okay, this is important. But when you take that, it's really being present, right? It's like when you take that message in and you actually let it reflect in your behavior, that's when people really feel like, wow, they get it.
And you regain all the hope right there,
Yes,
because it's
and
like,
trust.
oh, real
Actions
progress.
speak louder than words.
Progress.
They always do.
They always will,
Right?
yeah.
They always do.
My goodness.
Fact.
This was absolute fire.
Yeah, it
We're going to
was.
have to do a round 3 in the very near future.
For sure.
Yeah.
Assuming
dig it?
she's game.
Right. I know.
I'm game.
This was overwhelming. All right.
enjoyed
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so very much for joining us. We hope you learned as much as Alan and I did, and we were super excited. And this was Tory Eletto.
Thank you.
Thank you. Talk soon.
Bye. Ladies and gentlemen, we hope you enjoyed this episode as much as Alan and I enjoyed recording it. Up next, we have a very special 5-minute clinic on the word attitude. So, if you go into a new environment or a new learning experience with a positive attitude, I guarantee that you will take away more.
I want you to ask yourself the following questions. Am I going into every new endeavor with a positive mental attitude? After the endeavor, am I looking at the results from a positive lens in either an effort to learn or to be proud of myself for really fear chasing and going outside my comfort zone? Your attitude is going to pepper everything you do in your life, and you got to cultivate a strong, positive mental attitude.
We hope you will enjoy that episode, and we will talk to you on Monday.
Talk to you soon.
Bye. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so very much for listening to another episode of the Hyper Conscious Podcast.
Going hyper-conscious will absolutely change your life, because if you understand why something is the way it is, now you have the power to change it. If you going hyper-conscious with us has changed your life in any way, please share this episode with one of your friends, because the more people that go hyper-conscious, the better this world's going to be for everybody.
And if you would kindly leave us a 5-star review on iTunes, that would help us make more people hyper-conscious, and we would be greatly appreciative.
Thank you.
Bye.